Hello. We're going to start with our next conversation. My name is Charlie Sedkamp. I'm from Ohio. This is my fourth consecutive summit, and I love it. Thank you. I'm here to introduce our next two guests. Amit Agarwal. I hope I got that close. Okay. Was the advisor in the Office of Legal Counsel during both the George W. Bush and Barack Obama administrations. He was a Solicitor General of Florida. He is, on Monday, he's going to start his new job as a special counsel for Protect Democracy. And our other guest is the Alberto Gonzales. We all know him as the 80th Attorney General of the United States. He served in the Office of Legal Counsel under President Bush. Before that, he was the Secretary of the State of Texas. He is currently in academia teaching a course on national security law. So without further ado, our next conversation.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and great to see all of you. And thank you so much, Judge Gonzales, for joining us today. So we're meeting for the first time today in person, but in a sense, this is kind of a reunion of sorts for us, because back in the day, my first job at DOJ, you were the Attorney General. And so I looked at the org chart a little bit, and by my count, you were the boss of my boss, of my boss, of my boss, of my boss. I might be missing a few bosses in there.
You're making me feel very old.
Well, so I was at the Office of Legal Counsel. I want to tell you a short story just before we start. So one of the neat things about being at OLC is that you get to meet a lot of just unbelievable attorneys, and you get to work with people who serve at high levels in the Justice Department. And our suite of offices was just down the hall from the Attorney General. So we would every once in a while, the Attorney General would come to our office and give us a talk and stuff like that. So a couple of years ago, I was at a conference. I met a former Attorney General, one of your successors, and I introduced myself and I said, I'm sure you don't remember me, but I just want to let you know, you came and you spoke to our office one day when I was just a humble attorney advisor at the Office of Legal Counsel, and he said, no, that's not true. And I was like, yeah, that's true. I was there. I remember meeting you. He was like, no, that's not what I mean. He's like, in my experience, no one who ever worked at the Office of Legal Counsel was humble. So how do you feel about that?
You must be talking about John Yoo. Was that, okay. I'm delighted to be here. I think this is a very important conversation because I think too many people in this country are concerned about what's going on, and they may feel isolated and not sure what to do. And it's good to gather together as a group and talk about these things and to understand that you're not alone in feeling worried, maybe even a little scared, certainly confused and wondering where this is all going to end. Let me just end my little introduction by saying we live in the greatest country on the face of the earth. It is not even close, but my apologies to anyone who's not from America, but the thing that makes this country so great is the rule of law. And if we lose that, it is the glue that holds this country together. And if we lose that, we lose our democracy. So this is a very important conversation. You're meeting some people that are very, very influential, very thoughtful, and can really make a difference, but it requires your help. I'm asked, well, what can we do? Look, it is true that we have concerns about where the Supreme Court may go with some of these decisions. It is true that we have a Congress that appears to be totally useless, certainly cowardly. But the real power in this country is with you. It's with the people. And we can never lose sight of that. And so you should not lose hope so long as you have the ability to work together with others, to think intelligently, and to be brave. That is very, very important. Okay, let's
jump into it?
Let's jump into it.
All right, so we're supposed to be talking about the state of the rule of law in American society today. I've been on vacation for a few months, so I don't know, is anything going on with the rule of law? Is that what is, let me put it this way. So you are, I think, the only person in American history to have served as the Attorney General of the United States and as counsel to the President of the United States. And on top of that, you've been a judge for a state Supreme Court, served in the federal government and state government at the very highest levels. With all that perspective, what's your kind of big picture, stepping back, what's your take on the state of the rule of law today?
Well, clearly the rule of law is being tested, right? Some would say it's really straining almost to the breaking point. But think about it. The rule of law is tested every day, right? It's tested every day in our courtrooms. It's tested every day in the police stations and the police stops. It's tested every day by decisions you make, whether to speed, break the law and speed, or jaywalk across a busy intersection. And so it is tested every day. Now, it's being tested, I think, to a degree that perhaps we haven't seen before, or at least not for a period of time. But the rule of law is elastic. It's not static. And the reason it's so is because it involves human decision-making, human judgment, human experience. And as long as that is part of the equation, there are going to be ebbs and flows about the strength and the scope of the rule of law. But there's no question about it. I mean, I think that's why you're all here, is because I think you want to get some ideas and maybe hope about what the future is for this country. But as I said at the outset, the rule of law is very, very important. And as lawyers, I'm very proud of the ABA. The ABA has recently come out with several directives and views about the challenges to the rule of law. For lawyers, listen, if we can't stand up and defend the rule of law, who can? And so I think it's a primary responsibility for lawyers to call out excesses, to call out abuses, to call out challenges to the rule of law. So am I worried? Yeah, I'm worried, of course. But I'm also very optimistic and hopeful that we can make a difference and that at the end of the day, we will remain a great country.
Okay, so you mentioned that there are ways in which the rule of law is under stress today, and let's talk about some of those ways and get your take on them. So one is we've been hearing a lot of talk recently about the possibility that the executive branch could defy court judgments. And, so you have two different perspectives on this. I read a poll recently that said something like upwards of 80% of the American people think it's just obvious that the executive branch is duty-bound to follow court judgments. There's a different perspective that we are hearing, sometimes at different levels of explicitness from high-level officials. And I want to just get your take on a couple of statements. So J.D. Vance, the vice president, had a prior recorded comment in 2021 suggesting that the executive branch, maybe the president, doesn't have to follow judgments that he doesn't like, and said something to the effect of, well, this is the quote, "My advice to the president would be, if you're reelected, you should, quote, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat and every civil servant in the administrative state, and when the courts stop you, stand before the country like Andrew Jackson did and say, quote, the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it."
Well, we have to remember that J.D. Vance graduated from Yale Law School, right? Okay. No, Yale, of course, is a great law school. And I attribute those comments to him not being as precise as he should be. I think as a lawyer, he understands that we have an obligation to follow the decisions of the courts. Sometimes the courts get it wrong, right? Even at the Supreme Court level. Plessy v. Ferguson, for example. I mean, and so the court comes back and makes corrections. So it is true that sometimes the courts they don't get it quite right. Nonetheless, I think we all have an obligation to obey court orders, and I think J.D. Vance would agree that is certainly the case, and that's been the case from the founding fathers. And while it's true that the Constitution doesn't specify that the court has a final say as to what the Constitution and what our laws mean, I think it's pretty well understood. Someone like Alexander Hamilton was a big proponent of laying out the case as to why the courts should be the final word. And I have confidence at the end of the day that when the court makes a final decision on a executive action, that the president will follow that. And I was talking to a person earlier today about this very topic, and as far as I'm concerned, until that happens, we don't have a constitutional crisis. It is okay to criticize the Supreme Court. That happens all the time. As you may remember, President Obama, during a State of the Union, was very critical of the court to their face about the Citizens United case. I thought that was inappropriate, quite frankly. But nonetheless, there was criticism. And we need to understand that the court, by and large, is doing the very best it can to get it right. And we have an obligation, I think, and lawyers in particular, to abide by the decisions of the court. And if we believe the court is wrong, listen, I walked into the Oval Office 4 times during the War on Terror. We had given President Bush advice about the scope of his authority as the executive chief and commander-in-chief to deal with Guantanamo detainees, to deal with certain other matters relating to the War on Terror. And the Supreme Court 4 times said the lawyers working together, not just me, but at Justice, at State, CIA, that we had given the president wrong advice. And so I'm walking into the Oval Office and tell the President of the United States the advice we gave you was wrong. That's hard to do. And fortunately, I had a boss, President Bush, who responded, that's what the courts are for. The courts are there to tell us whether or not we get it right. If we do, we move forward. If they say we're not getting it right, then we change course. And I'm hopeful, we'll have to see, but I'm hopeful this president will deal with that kind of news in the same fashion. Now I hear laughter in the audience.
What happens if the president doesn't follow a court order?
Well, that's a good question. I guess we'll have to wait and see. I guess I am hopeful that at that point Congress will say enough is enough, and they will have certain. Again, I'm hearing laughter, and maybe I'm too optimistic about our country and about our branches of government. And I'm sorry. Well, then obviously what Congress can do is cut off funding, pass legislation, impeach the president, remove the president. That's always an option. If someone has a better idea about what to do, please let me know, and one that's lawful and constitutional, let me know.
And members of Congress. The gentleman said that the court could swear in officers to perform the relevant duties. I mean, it's a tough situation.
It really is tough, because those people may say, no, I'm not going to do it.
Yeah. I mean,
and the president may say, no, I'm not going to listen.
Maybe we could shift gears a little bit just for a second. No, along these lines, because this was one thing that was interested to get your perspective on, is sort of the politics of the rule of law. Because the struggle that we are all in right now, it's got a legal dimension to it. There are court victories, court defeats. That's one part of it. But there's kind of a broader struggle in terms of persuading the public and winning elections and making sure that we have people in positions of power who actually respect and will follow the rule of law. So I served on the campaign recently. One thing that I would hear a lot, kind of like out in public, is people saying, we need to stop talking about democracy and the rule of law because voters don't care about that, or at least the voters that you're trying to get don't care about that. And I live in the DC area. We had family come visit us. We went to the National Mall this last weekend. I saw the memorials. I read those words on the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, Supreme Court building, equal justice under law. And I look around me and I see people in those areas. I like to watch people, and while they're reading those words, and there's this kind of palpable sense of reverence that I see. And I want to know, is it just me? Because my feeling is, a lot of people say democracy and the rule of law are not winning political issues. It seems to me like this could be an incredibly powerful political issue in addition to something that we should fight for and something that could be a unifying principle in our politics. What do you say to that?
Well, putting aside, obviously, it can be a very powerful, potent political issue. I don't view it as a political issue. It is part of who we are as a country, the rule of law. As I said at the outset, it is the glue that holds this country together. And if we lose that, then we no longer have a democracy. Now, in order to protect the rule of law, that doesn't entitle us, it seems to me, to break the law in order to enforce the law. It's got to be done under a legal structure. And hopefully, we have put in place, setting aside the person in the Oval Office, we've put in place individuals with the character and the morality, the morals, to make sure the laws are followed.
All right. Some thoughts. We're hearing some thoughts on that issue. So let's talk about something that's been in the news a lot recently, and I think is on folks' minds, and that is prosecutorial independence and the rule of law. So there's a lot of attention being paid right now to the prosecution of the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams. You had a wave of high-profile resignations out of the Southern District of New York when prosecutors were ordered to dismiss a prosecution, and they felt, their view was that this sort of smacked of a quid pro quo, and that it was not an ethical thing to dismiss the charges under those circumstances, that they didn't have a plausible basis for telling the court that it should dismiss those charges. What's your take on that?
I think it's a mess. I think it's a mess at the Department of Justice. I'm surprised we haven't heard more from the Attorney General. Someone explained this to me this way in terms of the role of the Attorney General in the Department of Justice. And that is the Department of Justice is the castle, and the Attorney General is the moat around the castle. And the job of the Attorney General is to protect the Department of Justice. And right now, the Department of Justice, its reputation is being tattered by what's going on in New York. And I must tell you, I've had a great deal of respect, and I think they're heroes, the people that resigned in response to what is going on. Don't you agree? And they did the absolute right thing. And as we all know, these aren't crazy liberals. These are people that clerked for Scalia, clerked for Kavanaugh, clerked for Roberts, the members of the Federal Society. So these people revere the rule of law. They revere the Department of Justice. And they quit. Why? Because they were ordered to do something they felt was fundamentally wrong. And again, I don't know what I don't know. And oftentimes, decisions are made at the White House, at all levels of our federal government, based on information that we just don't know, okay? So let's just remember that. But based on what I know, based on what I've observed, this is just wrong. This was wrong. And I wonder, where did this really begin? I can't help but think this has got to be manipulated by the White House. And I'm assuming what happened is probably the chief of staff or the counsel contacts the DAG, the Deputy Attorney General, and says this is what we want to have happen. And I don't know whether or not there was pushback from the DAG. I don't know whether or not the DAG consulted with the Attorney General. I assume that the DAG did because this is a big deal. And the DAG should have understood this is going to cause huge ripples within the Department of Justice. And so was there then an attempt to talk the White House back? Well, we all know this president doesn't want to admit mistakes and is not likely to change course. But at that time, it's really, really too late. And I think, again, based on what I know, I think the lawyers that resigned did the absolute right thing. And it really is, it's sad for me. I love the Department of Justice. And I think there's a lot of doubt within the people that work there today about their future and about what does the Department of Justice stand for going forward.
So one of the remarkable things, from my perspective, I served in DOJ at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami for 6 years, and one of the remarkable things about that story was it was reported that the acting Deputy Attorney General, in communicating with Ms. Sassoon, said pretty explicitly that the directive to dismiss the charges was not based on either an assessment of the seriousness of the charges or the sufficiency of the evidence, but that, among other things, kind of one of the considerations was that the mayor thought that the pending prosecution would be an impediment to cooperating with the federal government in the enforcement of its immigration policy.
And immediately I thought, well, doesn't the mayor have thousands of people that work for him? Could he not direct them to enforce immigration policy, or was the mayor going to be out there with a lasso rounding up people by himself? I couldn't understand that rationale, honestly. Sure, it's a distraction, but nonetheless, the prosecution should have gone forward based upon the judgment of experienced career prosecutors that a federal crime had been committed and that the United States of America could prove it in a court of law, but nonetheless, that's not what happened here.
Yeah. So what's your advice to career civil servants who find themselves in these positions these days, who are serving in the Department of Justice? I mean, what do they do when they're confronted with these types of scenarios?
Well, I think they continue to remain at the department because we need that talent and that experience at the Department of Justice, right? And hopefully you don't find yourself in a scenario or encounter a situation where you're given a directive that you just fundamentally disagree with and you are unable to talk your superior from changing the position that he or she is telling you you have to take in a court of law. There are some wonderful, dedicated people that work at the Department of Justice. I know that certainly before the election, and I think probably still continues today, a lot of talk about the weaponization of the Department of Justice, the fact that there were so many investigations and prosecutions with respect to President Trump. And listen, our criminal justice system is not perfect, so I'm not going to assume that it gets it right all the time. But we shouldn't also assume that just because President Trump was investigated and prosecuted, that in fact it wasn't deserved, right? I mean, to me, and there are other decisions that I'm just going to spout off on some things. It is a betrayal to the men and women at the Department of Justice who were fired because they participated in the prosecution of the January 6th rioters. You're doing your job, you're doing it successfully, and you get fired. That is a complete betrayal. I think it's a betrayal to the American people for the president to pardon, particularly those individuals that are dangerous. That the president's pardon power is virtually absolute in the Constitution. So I get that he has the authority to do that. There's no question about it. But it was a wrong thing to do. Absolutely wrong thing to do to grant those pardons, at least, and certainly without going through case by case to determine whether or not they were dangerous, whether or not they'd hurt police officers, et cetera, had damaged the Capitol. That was another betrayal, a betrayal to the American people, because those prosecutions took time. They took a lot of your taxpayer dollars to be successful in achieving. And so that was also a betrayal, as far as I'm concerned, to the American people.
Yes. And those cases are presided over by Republican-appointed judges, Democratic-appointed judges. You've got to go through a lot of process before you get a conviction in a federal criminal case. So on the issue of the pardons, one of your jobs as Attorney General and as White House counsel was to provide advice related to clemency matters. So if you're White House counsel or you're Attorney General, you're asked for your advice about the possibility of granting executive clemency to people who used violence to try to beat up police officers, to obstruct the peaceful and orderly transfer of power. What do you say?
Well, I knew Bush pretty well because of our days in Texas. So in Texas, part of my job as general counsel for Governor Bush was to present clemency petitions to Governor Bush. I got to know pretty well the kind of cases that he would be receptive to. He would never grant a pardon to someone who had hurt a child, for example, or murdered someone, or beat up his wife or a spouse. And so I a pretty good idea of what would work and what wouldn't work, and whether I should even take anything to him. With respect, and obviously when he became president, we had a process where it began with a pardon attorney. The pardon attorney would review the case, make a recommendation to the Deputy Attorney General. The Deputy Attorney General would then consult with me about cases that he thought merited favorable consideration by the president, and then I would take the request to the president. So with respect to what happened on January 6th, I cannot speak for President Bush, but just based on history, there is absolutely no way that he would have granted any kind of clemency to anyone who hurt anyone, particularly police officers that day, or damaged the Capitol. And he would, I think we'd have to find a line, a way to draw a line to grant clemency, some type of clemency. Maybe not a pardon, maybe a commutation, where they would get time served, but they wouldn't be able to, to get rid of the record. Individual determinations, I think, would have been very important to him, because some of those people may have deserved pardon. They may have been totally innocent walking to the Capitol, thinking, I'm just hanging around, and not had any intention of participating in what actually happened there. So I think individual determinations would have been important to him.
So shifting gears just a little bit, so in addition to the pardons, which were on day one, we've seen a series of executive orders kind of trying to make policy on all kinds of different levels. I always thought, as kind of conservative, that conservatives in particular believed that Congress was the first branch of government for a reason. Were you running out of time? Yeah, okay.
Okay, last question.
Last question.
We want to get back on time, so
Yeah.
out of respect for the audience.
All right, so we will end on this note, on the issue about the rule of law being nonpartisan. You recently took the step of, even though you served at a high level in a Republican administration, you took the step of endorsing the Democratic presidential nominee last year. Why did you?
Did all of you vote for Harris?
Why did you do that?
Listen, I've seen the power of that office. It's the most powerful position in the world. And the most important thing for that person to have is the right character to exercise power. Power is intoxicating. You don't want to give it up. I've seen it. And so if you don't have the right character, I think it was Nathan Hale who said, reputation is what your friends think of you. Character is what only the God and the angels know about you. So it's hard sometimes to determine whether someone has the right character to occupy that office. But for me, having observed Donald Trump during his first term and during his campaign, I just couldn't get over the fact that he doesn't have the character to be president of the United States. Don't get me wrong, I have issues, some of them very serious, about some of the policy positions. But for me, the number one consideration for the presidency, we can disagree about policy, but character is something that is just too important to compromise. And that's why I supported Harris.
Thank you so much. I was on the campaign at the time that you wrote that op-ed endorsing Vice President Harris. I will just say for my part, it meant a lot to me, and I felt a sense of a surge of hope, I think, and of optimism, and not just in the sense that it makes any one person standing up makes an immediate difference, but there's that sense that there are people of integrity and courage and character who are willing to stand up for American democracy and to put country over party, and for that and for so much else, I think you deserve our thanks. So thank you.
Thank you.